For the last session of the day today at our GRC summit, I have two very esteemed panelists from two companies that are right in the epicenter of news and a topic that is up for very healthy debate: how to balance trust and innovation in healthcare. That's a topic that there's raging debate on right now in the media, in innovation circles, and in trust circles, in privacy circles. A whole bunch of debate going on, as you know. So I'm extremely pleased to have two panelists with me. One who you've probably met earlier in the day, Steve Ferguson. Steve is the Deputy Director of Licensing and Entrepreneurship at the National Institute of Health. As you know, NIH is in the news. They're doing a lot in terms of how they're balancing all the orchestration of the activities. Steve has in the past also served as a scientist at the National Cancer Institute, and in addition, he also is an instructor at the USDA Graduate School and the NIH Graduate School as well. So welcome, Steve. We also Steve in his spare time is also and part of the NIH orchestra. I don't know how much time you guys have for orchestra these days, but I'm sure we'll take your experience in orchestrating this discussion. Welcome, Steve, again.
Right. Thank you.
We need more yes, go ahead, please, Steve.
I said we need more time for music these days, I think, as well.
No, absolutely, absolutely. And the other person I have on the panel is Abhiru Gandhi. Abhiru serves as the trust and compliance head for Verily, which is part of Google and Alphabet. And Abhiru has also, been a veteran in the compliance and risk space for many, many years, having worked with Insight Life Sciences, Genentech, Mallinckrodt, serving in senior executive positions. But I'm pretty sure that Verily is a completely different world, with all the innovation happening at Verily and pushing the boundaries, if you will, in terms of both healthcare innovation, but also data, logistics, and many other things. Abhiru, obviously shares his name with Mahatma Gandhi. So I don't know, Abhiru, is that the reason why you got the job?
Those are, sometimes I wonder myself, Gaurav, and those are lofty ideals. So I will say, though, that when I joined one of my previous companies, when they sent out my announcement, there was a board member that said, it's good to have a Gandhi as a compliance officer. So I guess maybe there is some truth to what you just said.
Yeah, I'm sure. No, thank you, both of you, to join the panel here. I'm going to kick it off with, just a simple question, and maybe Abhirup, you can go first. The healthcare industry is really at the peak of innovation, and especially which is Google Life Sciences. It has been phenomenal in terms of data infrastructure, tools to get insights, on data privacy and healthcare data particularly. But with new technology comes new kinds of risks like inaccurate diagnosis, privacy issues. How do you stay ahead of emerging risks, in your world, and ensure that there's no ethical and compliance implications, all that companies like Verily are doing?
So I think, Gaurav, you're right. I mean, it's a very exciting time, and I think I have the privilege of seeing it at closer quarters from where we are, and it is an absolutely exciting time in terms of a lot of the barriers to new technologies and sort of coming down very quickly, especially accelerated because of the current situation. But more generally, like looking at things that are impacting the world. And I think the life cycles, as short as they are, it's impacting more people much quicker than we saw traditional technologies. So examples of like liquid biopsy, right, which non-invasive technologies which are giving us a promise of detecting cancer early on. We're talking about closed loop, diabetic systems that patients can self-manage. So it's a lot of good promise there. And you're right. I mean, these bring new risks, right? They range from the legal and regulatory considerations to the ethical. And so it's important in the roles that we play that we see these early, right? So I think it's super important that at least internally serving in a business, as a business, is that we are asking questions at the outset. What does the business want to do? What are the objectives of the product? Like, what is this market we're trying to serve? Does it exist? Are we trying to build one? As example, I've noticed that sometimes we gravitate towards like the bright, shiny object, but the question we need to ask is like, what is the objective of that product? And if you ask enough questions at the outset, I think as a compliance officer, I mean, I feel more comfortable making a judgment call on some of the impact that it can make. But and I know this may sound a little bit like cliched, but keeping the patient at the center is the single most important thing that we could do in our roles, right? We serve as the conscience of the company. So asking questions like, how is what is this going to impact to the maybe the underserved population? There are folks in the outlier, can we remove bias, etc., right? So I think keeping the patient focus, but then using the traditional tools that we have from a compliance standpoint, right? The risk assessment, the elements, I think keeping those and being grounded in terms of what we want to do from a business like impact standpoint, I think are two things that I keep in mind. And I think I would suggest doing that even with new technologies. So, one example there is like looking at telemedicine, right? Telemedicine isn't new. I think with the COVID situation, it's being accelerated. It's really is a catalyst to everything from usage, both on the provider side, but also in terms of patient and consumer sentiment. But the risks in those, I don't think we are thinking about that today. We've been thinking about that for a while, but really sort of putting that again, the patient at the core, at the center, is probably pretty important there as well.
And Steve, you've come from a very deep kind of chemistry background, and and really lead a big part of the innovation. All your life has been centered around innovation. What's your view on this topic?
I think I agree. It's a very interesting time to be involved with science, medicine, and sort of public health. There's always an interesting challenge in science, but here we're doubled down in terms of the challenges that we're facing in public health. So I agree with the sentiment that we have to keep a patient focus. So as we work on various innovative technologies, it's very important to keep in mind the ultimate goal of our programs is really healthcare, in terms of translating the work that we do in the basic research labs and some of our preclinical programs into products that can make a difference in people's lives, manage sickness and suffering, and therefore provide real value to the public who's supporting all this work. So I think in doing that, we have to balance innovation, which is there's a number of innovative approaches that people can take for any given problem. I mean, that's probably the strength of what I've really enjoyed working at the National Institute of Health, is that the variety of approaches. We don't just sort of bet the farm on one particular approach. We're often funding or working on various approaches, and by balancing this sort of these approaches, come up with something that actually at the end of the day delivers the most value and hopefully is the best outcome for patient care. The other thing that's been very interesting is sort of to try to accelerate the pace of collaborations, particularly now as we get to more of an IT and AI sort of focus. The impact on some of the work that we're doing is really accelerating the impact and working with companies perhaps that we haven't worked with before outside the normal mainstream of traditional pharmaceutical companies, and really try to look at sort of really focus on solving the problems that we're looking at, trying to accelerate the pace of our traditional biochemistry and chemistry approaches. So it's really been an exciting time, and I think that by working on these collaborations, and not just collaboration with the United States, but collaborating with institutions throughout the world, we'll see some real effects. I think even with the COVID-19 situation, we've seen some very rapid developments that we wouldn't have normally seen because of the interest not only in the United States, but throughout the world in a variety of institutions to try to focus in and working together to sort of try to attack this problem.
Actually takes me to a related question. Well, throughout the last 2 days, there's been a lot of conversation, not just in healthcare, but also in banking and telcos, about this whole concept of open innovation, right? So how do you balance, collaboration, competitiveness, and conflict that can come from open innovation and open collaboration, right? So it is critical in healthcare. We are seeing it clearly over the last 3 months. It's very important to achieve faster, quicker results. And while there has been skepticism in the past topic, we are seeing healthcare organizations, opening up to collaborate, co-innovate, in spite of the various issues that can emerge around data privacy, intellectual property, uh, financial considerations, right? Third party licensing, etc. So my question really is that exposure at any of these levels could disrupt the innovation chain or the value chain. How organizations managing this? And Steve, maybe you can take this first.
For sure. And then I think that open innovation is a very important part of our core structure. So even though we're part of the National Institutes of Health, we're part of the Public Health Service, at the department level, we're at Health and Human Services, it's very clear that we have a health focus. But at the same time, even though the size of our organization, and NIH, as many people are aware of, is probably the world's largest biomedical research institution. So even with an institution of that size and with a health focus, we still aren't going to be able to deliver actual products to the marketplace, new products to the innovations to the bedside, new treatments in the clinic without working with partners. So with anything, it's showed even the greater need to work more closely with partners, particularly private sector partners, but also academic and NGO and other types of organizations that have a public health mission. So I think by working even more closely with partnerships, we'll be able to actually see the results of innovation, not just appear in maybe in scientific papers, but actually see them actually translate, being transmitted into things that will make an important difference for not only this particular pandemic, but other health issues that we're currently dealing with and maybe issues that will emerge in the future. It's really going to be about partnerships.
Abhiru, again, Verily is also partnering with a number of companies, with some risks and obviously dimensions of acceleration. What's your view on this topic of open innovation?
I fully agree with Steve. I know the examples may be a little different, but I fully agree that the partnership and collaboration model is really serving the new technologies a lot better. And the reason is that when I can speak for like tech companies trying to become healthcare or life science companies, I think we're pretty strong on the toolkit, right? We understand how to build some of these technologies from the ground up. They're pretty innovative in terms of like there's nothing else out there. Software as a medical device comes to mind as one big stream there. But what we don't have is we don't actually have the data that healthcare institutions have. So we have what they don't have. Maybe we're better about and faster with some of the innovation around software and technology, but we don't have the data and they do. Likewise, in terms of commercial partnerships, a lot of the large pharma and large med device companies have very established sales and marketing practices. They have people on the boots on the ground. They've got good relationships with academic institutions and commercial and the payer organizations. And digital health companies just starting off or tech companies don't have that. So that kind of partnership is critical. But each one of those, again, brings a certain set of things that we need to consider from a risk standpoint and mitigate those. So as example, joint ventures are becoming more and more common. Again, it's sort of a marriage of companies to get the best out of both. But you need to do the adequate amount of due diligence before you sign with a partner, and not just from are they the right partner strategically, but also do they have sort of pending issues from a compliance standpoint that might carry over to your own organizations. And I think the most important thing there is we call it a collaboration, but a lot of times it becomes more like you do your thing, I do my thing. And we kind of lose that in between sort of working closely with them. And I think that's what I'm seeing at close quarters is the sooner and the better you do it. Some partners are better than the others, and we are better with some partners than the others. That it's a lot healthier if you're in there early and often. So, example is one good thing that I think has come out of these are sort of what we could call pilots, right? Where pilots they're not just like pre-production simulated environments, they're in the real world. But those are the best places to learn, where your exposure levels in terms of risk is lower, but you learn enough that when you actually do go into scaling that model, it becomes a lot easier. And from a compliance standpoint, it's easier to manage as well.
And I would certainly agree,
Go ahead,
that I would agree that the collaborations that provide the most impact, that have the most benefit, are ones that have intellectual contribution by both parties. So really to take advantage of the strengths of each organization, it really needs the intellectual contribution and intellectual interaction that to really stimulate the process. And I think that's the ones that we've had the most success with. I think that's the model that we'd like to see going forward, is really using the key resources. And as you mentioned, sometimes it's in IT related aspects, sometimes it may be more patient care, sometimes it may be more wet chemistry, but combine and mix those resources and have the stimulus of different disciplines, making the organization that's working together have different skill sets forward. I think that's really going to be the key. I mean, the present example would be, looking at sort of the development of the COVID-19 vaccine. They were starting to work on developing the vaccine, never having isolated the virus, but working on the sequence that were provided by others. So having those types of early collaborations really accelerates the whole process.
And Abhiru and Steve, one thing related to this. So I had the luxury of talking to, three of the R&D heads in the last few months of three of the big five pharma, if you will, right? And when I asked them, who do you worry about the most? And the answer actually came back from two out of the three, that is Google. And I asked them why. And they said because of two words, computing power. Okay, obviously Verily, supported by Google and Alphabet, has a lot of computing power, for genomic research and other research areas. But how, as a trust and compliance officer, do you try to maintain the balance, like use of AI, for example, or big data or analytics, right? And other digital innovations. How do you retain the balance to ensure that there's good governance, accountability, transparency in AI applications so that the bias and discrimination is mitigated?
That's a really tough one. I'll offer what I think is my, is the right way to go about doing things, but it's an evolving issue, as I'm sure everyone's aware, in terms of there's no real answers just yet from a regulatory standpoint, particularly. But I think, when you mentioned governance and accountability, I think I would, governance, depending on how you look at it, I don't know if there's a central body necessarily that's going to be effective. So it's really left to organizations to demonstrate that they're doing it for the right reasons and they're doing it the right way. And it's okay to have a commercial objective. But, and I'll give you a couple examples where I think that's very relevant. So when you look at diagnoses, that AI is really used in the healthcare side, I'd say like in phase one is definitely seen as more effective from a diagnostic standpoint. So medical imaging is a big one, right? Whether it's for the eye or it's for other organs. And the FDA also has taken a very open position about looking at these and in fact approving more than a couple of these today that are in the real world. But it's a little bit static, right? Because these models are sort of premised on the fact that they're locked and loaded, and they're not actually on the AI front in terms of the self-learning model or the training models of these things. So we're not completely there yet from a regulatory standpoint. So I think I would really hope for a level of transparency for organizations, and I think that's that's important because it builds trust, not just with the end user, but with physicians in this case, where demand needs to be created, but they're not entirely convinced that we're ready to move away from the very standard randomized clinical studies sort of evidence standard to something else. And what that something else is today hasn't really been set. So I think transparency, that companies have to be able to decide if the algorithm in this case, or AI-based algorithm, is the magic sauce. Are they willing to be more transparent about how that's built? Are they willing, to your point, like in terms of clinical studies, are we able to reduce the biases on the current system in the more sort of brick and mortar world of clinical studies to the virtual clinical studies? Are we willing to now expand the base and have a more diverse set of subjects for clinical studies, right? How open are companies to taking that position today and then being able to publish? I think, Steve, you mentioned something about publishing scientific evidence, right? Tech companies that have the technology need to understand that side of it. And the more traditional companies that have always done it that way need to understand that there's tools. And I actually do think with COVID, again, another good example is where clinical studies are moving very rapidly from being 100% physically located in the physical sites to having a lot of that done remotely, whether it's remote monitoring or actually at-home testing or at-home sort of metric measurement that can feed into the clinical studies.
No, thank you. And Steve, I'm going to ask you a tough question related to partly this, but even at a broader level. If you go back to 2008, post the 2008 crisis, there's a significant erosion of trust in financial systems, banks, government bodies as well. Similar element is now reflected in the current crisis with healthcare institutions. The lack of preparedness, absence of gears at times, spike in infected individuals, all of that stuff, right? What is your view on how healthcare companies, including and companies like Verily or even some of the other pharma, med device, and hospital companies, what's their opportunity to retool themselves and re-engineer systems so that the core healthcare elements are protected and while doing it ethically?
So I think the real opportunity here is to accelerate use of IT and AI, particularly in sort of the discovery and preclinical phase of, of development. I mean, you look at the history of development of diagnostics, of vaccines and therapeutics, there's a huge number of early failures or missed opportunities that just because we didn't really understand the chemistry very well or the disease very well. So I think with some of this new information sources, this new way to accelerate learning about these systems, about these diseases, we would be able to increase the power so that when we do go into the clinic and actually treat patients, we have a better qualified candidate. It's just not a random event that we're just trying out for the first time. I mean, for all the work that goes into this, there's still such a high failure rate. If we could just find a way to reduce the failure rate of products going through development, making better informed choices on the front end, that would represent a savings to both a number of institutions that are investing in healthcare and probably shorten the timeline so the patients, the public, the funding agency would see a better return. So I'm hopeful that this whole process will help stimulate the investment that's needed in some things that quite aren't so glamorous, but research tools, model systems, programs to really accelerate the discovery and early stage development process. And then I think at the end, you still have to test in humans and see if it really works. For all the model systems that we have, for all the data systems, they're still going to have to probably do some testing. But if we can improve the front end and eliminate the waste and missed opportunities, the dry holes that we're drilling inadvertently, but to have that part go much better, quicker, faster, I think at the end we'll see significant payouts. And it doesn't take too many successes to really make this have a real impact on healthcare, regardless of which disease or sector you're talking about.
No, thank you, Steve. And we have a couple of questions from the audience as well. Actually, we have many. Unfortunately, we can't answer given we have a few minutes left here. But I'm going to ask one Abhiru to you. There's a question from a gentleman at Baxter. Okay, have you adjusted your audit plan given the COVID-19 events here, or find additional areas of risk that you were not addressing earlier?
Short answer, absolutely. Longer answer, we are actually conducting, and I know for a fact that being part of industry consortiums like trade groups like AdvoMed, this is more than just us. We're doing a very, very rapid risk assessment to evaluate. For one thing, I think you mentioned at the outset, Gaurav, that Verily is sort of out there. We're doing testing and screening, and we're looking to really sort of provide the infrastructure we built around the technology to as many entities that can use them. But that brings a set of new risks. But yes, we are absolutely looking at, I don't know if I'm ready to from an audit plan, but actually doing a really rapid risk assessment to tweaks it, but also informing our from a governance standpoint, informing our compliance committee and eventually the different stakeholders in the company and our partners, like our joint venture and our collaboration partners, in terms of some of the new activities that need to start emerging out of this.
No, thank you. And Steve, there's one question for you, and then we'll wrap up with one question for each as a final one. Okay, so one, you have mentioned in the past that risk of not being prepared is not quantified well in healthcare. Can you just comment on it? It kind of relates to one of the questions that came in as well, but if you can just, shed some color to that.
Could you repeat the question, please?
Risk of not being prepared in healthcare is not quantified as well, and that's why there's a latency to solve it.
Right. So part of the risk is that a lot of the things that in development you work on development, but you hope that it never comes forward. I mean, I can recall working on licensing out not one but four different Ebola drug vaccine candidates, for example, during the 2000s. They all stalled out for commercial reasons primarily, because of lack of a market. But then when the outbreak came out in the Congo, people asked, well, where was the vaccine? So I think at some extent you have to be willing to make the investment in these things, even though maybe they're not likely to come, or you hope that they never did come forward. So I think there's going to have to be some consideration given to continuing our investment in basic research, in model systems, and having a basic understanding of human physiology that really will enable us to be prepared, even though it's maybe not be an exciting thing in a forefront in the newspaper today, but it could make us ready. It could provide some basic understanding, and that's kind of a very particular strong focus at NIH since I've been there, is that there's still a strong investment in basic research. So we can't, in our rush to have things come to the market, we still don't want to neglect our investment in basic research.
And in one sentence, the risk, compliance, governance, ethics professionals in the audience today, if there's one piece of advice you would give to these professionals on how they need to reskill themselves for the new normal, what would that be? Just a brief one. And Steve, you can go first.
So I would say diversify your approaches, because it's very difficult, no matter how well you plan, to really predict the future. So from a technical perspective, from a product development perspective, you need to sort of keep multiple options, multiple approaches, because it's risky to begin with, and you never really know what you're going to need. So keep an open mind to keep a number of approaches open as much as possible.
Fully agree with Steve, and I'll add, I agree with him about being flexible, being open, but adapt very quickly. Adapt, because
Right.
the first thing I would do is just look around your company or your sphere of influence and inventory everything that's digital, today, everything that's being digitized for tomorrow. And it could range from anything as simple as an e-marketing channel all the way to something, Steve, you were talking about, discovery, like drug discovery and early science, impacted by, again, big data, digitization. And start thinking ahead. You will have to be ahead of the business.
No, thank you very, very much for all the insights. And I would definitely encourage you to carry on all the good work that you do. Keep us private, but more importantly, keep us safe here. Thank you very much, Steve and Abhiru, for joining the session.